I'm 63 years old, and until 6 months ago, I believed family meant everything. My name is Patricia Wells, though most people call me Patty, and I've spent the last 38 years of my life in the suburbs of Denver, Colorado, raising my son Michael and building what I thought was a loving, supportive family. I worked as a high school guidance counselor for 27 years before retiring, which means I've seen every type of manipulative teenager you can imagine. I thought that experience had prepared me for anything. I was wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My late husband David passed away from a heart attack 3 years ago, leaving me with a modest but comfortable life insurance policy, a paid-off house in a nice neighborhood, and a son I was incredibly proud of. Michael had grown up to be a software engineer, kind-hearted and responsible, the type of man who still called his mother every Sunday and helped elderly neighbors with their yard work. When he told me he was getting serious with someone named Jessica Chen, a marketing coordinator he'd met through work, I was thrilled. At 32, Michael had dated occasionally, but never brought anyone home to meet me. Jessica must be special, I thought. The first time I met Jessica was at a family barbecue I hosted in my backyard. She arrived wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, carrying a purse I recognized from the window of an upscale boutique downtown. She was undeniably beautiful, with perfectly styled black hair and makeup that looked professionally applied, but there was something in her eyes that reminded me of the students who used to sit in my office, the ones who had perfected the art of telling adults exactly what they wanted to hear. During that first meeting, Jessica was charming in an almost calculated way. She complimented my garden, asked about family photos on the mantle, and even offered to help with dishes after dinner. Michael was clearly smitten, watching her every move with the devoted expression of a man completely in love. I wanted to be happy for him, I truly did. But something about Jessica felt performative, like she was auditioning for the role of perfect girlfriend rather than actually being herself. Over the following months, as their relationship became more serious, I began to notice patterns that troubled me. Jessica would make subtle comments about my house being quaint and vintage, always with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She'd suggest improvements that would modernize the space, expensive renovations that would require me to dip into my retirement savings. When I mentioned I was content with my home as it was, she'd laugh and say something like, "Oh, Patty, you're so set in your ways. Michael and I were just talking about how important it is to keep evolving." The engagement announcement came during Christmas dinner. Michael had insisted on hosting at his apartment, which I found odd since we'd always celebrated holidays at my house. But Jessica had convinced him that his place was more convenient for everyone. As we sat around their small dining table, Michael suddenly dropped to one knee and presented Jessica with a ring that must have cost several months of his salary. She squealed with delight, tears streaming down her face as she said yes, and I forced myself to smile and offer congratulations even as a cold dread settled in my stomach. The engagement period revealed Jessica's true nature in ways that both fascinated and horrified me. She approached wedding planning with the intensity of a military campaign, creating elaborate spreadsheets and Pinterest boards that she'd thrust in front of anyone who would look. The budget she proposed was astronomical, nearly $40,000 for a single day, and when Michael expressed concern about the cost, Jessica would dissolve into tears about how she'd dreamed of this day since she was a little girl. During one particularly uncomfortable dinner at my house, Jessica spread her wedding magazines across my dining room table and began explaining her vision. Everything had to be perfect, she insisted. The venue needed to accommodate at least 200 guests. The flowers had to be imported orchids. The dress had already been ordered from a boutique in New York, and the photographer she wanted charged more than most people spent on a used car. Michael sat beside her, occasionally wincing at the prices but never actually objecting. I watched my responsible, practical son transform into someone I barely recognized, nodding along to plans that would drain his savings and possibly put him in debt for years. When I gently suggested that perhaps they could find ways to reduce costs without sacrificing beauty, Jessica's perfectly applied smile faltered for just a moment. "Well, of course, if money is more important than Michael's happiness," she said, her voice taking on a hurt tone that I'd heard countless times from manipulative students. "I suppose we could have a courthouse wedding. I just thought this was supposed to be the most important day of our lives." Michael immediately rushed to reassure her, shooting me a look that clearly said I was being unreasonable. I backed down, not wanting to create conflict, but I made a mental note about Jessica's tactics. She was skilled at making others feel guilty for questioning her demands, positioning herself as the victim whenever anyone expressed concern about her extravagant expectations. As the months passed, Jessica's demands grew more elaborate and more expensive. She decided the original venue wasn't elegant enough and found another one that cost twice as much. The initial catering estimate was rejected in favor of a company that specialized in destination quality cuisine. Even the invitations became a production, with Jessica insisting on custom calligraphy and imported paper that cost more per invitation than most people spent on entire wedding announcements. I watched Michael become increasingly stressed as the financial pressure mounted. He'd always been careful with money, saving diligently and living within his means. But Jessica's vision required him to max out credit cards and even consider taking a loan against his retirement account. When I expressed concern during one of our Sunday phone calls, he became defensive in a way that was completely unlike him. "Mom, I know it seems like a lot, but Jessica deserves to have the wedding she wants," he said, his voice tight with exhaustion. "She's been planning this since we got engaged, and everything is already booked. It's too late to change things now." The way he said, "Jessica deserves," stuck with me. Not "we want" or "we've decided," but Jessica deserves, as if her desires were somehow more important than his financial security or peace of mind. I recognized the language of someone who had been thoroughly manipulated, convinced that questioning his partner's demands would make him a bad husband before he'd even become one. My concerns deepened when Jessica began making comments about my role in their lives after the wedding. During family dinners, she'd make casual remarks about how overwhelming it must be for Michael to feel responsible for taking care of me now that I was alone. She'd suggest that I might be happier in a retirement community where I could make friends my own age and have activities planned for me. "It's just that Michael worries about you so much," she'd say with fake concern. "He's always talking about whether you're lonely or if the house is too much for you to maintain. Maybe it would be better for everyone if you downsized to something more manageable." The truth was, I wasn't lonely, and my house wasn't too much to manage. I had a thriving social life with friends from my teaching career. I volunteered at the local animal shelter twice a week, and I was perfectly capable of maintaining my home. But Jessica's comments were designed to plant seeds of doubt, to make Michael feel guilty about my independence, and to position herself as the solution to problems that didn't actually exist. The breaking point came during a family dinner 3 months before the wedding. Jessica had been unusually quiet throughout the meal, picking at her food and occasionally sighing dramatically. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Finally, Michael asked if something was wrong, and she burst into tears. "I just don't think your mother likes me," she sobbed, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. "I try so hard to include her in our plans, but she always has something negative to say about the wedding. It's like she doesn't want us to be happy." I sat there in stunned silence as Jessica painted me as the villain in their love story. According to her tearful account, I had been sabotaging their wedding planning from the beginning, criticizing her choices, and making her feel unwelcome in the family. She claimed that my suggestions about reducing costs were actually attempts to humiliate her in front of her friends and family, and that my questions about their budget came from a place of jealousy rather than concern. Michael's expression grew increasingly troubled as Jessica spoke, and I could see him mentally reviewing our recent conversations through this new lens she was providing. By the time she finished her performance, complete with shaking hands and hitched breathing, he was looking at me with a mixture of disappointment and accusation. "Mom, is this true?" he asked, his voice heavy with hurt. "Have you been undermining Jessica's wedding plans?" I tried to explain that I had only expressed concern about the financial burden they were taking on, that my questions came from a place of love and worry for their future together. But Jessica had already poisoned the well, and every word I spoke seemed to confirm her narrative in Michael's mind. "I think maybe you need to step back from the wedding planning," he said finally, the words hitting me like a physical blow. "Jessica is going to be my wife, and I need you to respect her decisions, even if you don't agree with them." That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of the bedroom I'd shared with David for so many years, trying to understand how I had become the enemy in my own son's life. Jessica had masterfully manipulated the situation, positioning herself as the victim while making me appear controlling and unreasonable. She had isolated Michael from my influence while making him feel guilty for even listening to my concerns. Over the following weeks, my relationship with Michael grew strained in ways I'd never experienced. Our Sunday phone calls became stilted and brief, with Jessica often in the background offering commentary or reminding Michael of things he needed to tell me. When I tried to discuss anything other than surface-level pleasantries, he'd change the subject or cut the conversation short, claiming he had wedding planning to do. Jessica began sending me text messages that appeared supportive on the surface, but carried undertones of threat and manipulation. She'd write things like, "I hope you know how much Michael loves you, Patty. I just want us all to get along for his sake. The wedding is going to be so beautiful, and I really hope you'll be able to enjoy it without any stress or conflict." The subtext was clear. Behave yourself, don't cause problems, and remember that Michael's loyalty now belonged to her. She was training me to accept my diminished role in his life, preparing me for a future where I would be tolerated rather than cherished as his mother. 3 weeks before the wedding, Jessica called to inform me about my special role in the ceremony. She had decided that I would be seated in the third row rather than the traditional front row reserved for the mother of the groom, because the front row needed to be saved for her grandparents who were flying in from China. When I asked about the traditional mother-son dance, she explained that they had decided to skip it in favor of a special performance Jessica had choreographed with her maid of honor. "I just think it's more modern this way," she explained, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "We don't want anyone to feel left out or awkward, and since you're not much of a dancer anyway, this seems like the best solution for everyone." Each decision stripped away another piece of my traditional role as mother of the groom, relegating me to the status of distant relative rather than the woman who had raised and loved the groom for 32 years. But when I tried to discuss my hurt feelings with Michael, he accused me of being selfish and trying to make their wedding about me. "Jessica is trying so hard to make you feel included," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "Why can't you just be happy for us and stop creating drama?" The word drama cut deep. I had spent my entire adult life being the steady, supportive presence in his life, the one who celebrated his successes and comforted him during failures. Now I was being painted as a dramatic troublemaker simply for wanting to maintain some connection to my son during one of the most important events of his life. 2 weeks before the wedding, I received an invitation to Jessica's bridal shower, which was being held at an upscale restaurant downtown. The invitation was beautiful, printed on expensive cardstock with elegant calligraphy, but it arrived just 5 days before the event. When I called to RSVP, Jessica's maid of honor seemed surprised to hear from me. "Oh, you're actually coming?" she asked, her tone suggesting that my attendance wasn't expected or particularly wanted. That's great. I'll make sure there's a seat for you. The bridal shower was a lavish affair with 30 women who all seemed to know each other well. I sat at a table near the back, surrounded by Jessica's college friends and coworkers, feeling like an outsider at an event celebrating my future daughter-in-law. The gifts were expensive and coordinated, clearly chosen from a high-end registry, and I watched Jessica open present after present with the excited squeals of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. When Jessica opened my gift, a beautiful set of crystal wine glasses that had belonged to my grandmother, she held them up briefly and said, "Oh, how vintage. These will be perfect for our guest cottage." The dismissive tone in her voice made it clear that my family heirloom would be relegated to secondary status, something suitable for less important occasions. During the gift-opening portion of the shower, Jessica regaled the group with stories about wedding planning that painted me as a difficult and interfering mother-in-law. She described my budget concerns as nitpicking, and my questions about guest lists as micromanaging, all while maintaining a sweet smile and apologetic tone that suggested she was reluctantly sharing these burdens. "Poor Michael is caught in the middle," she sighed dramatically. "His mother means well, but she just has very different ideas about how things should be done. I keep telling him that this is our day, and we shouldn't have to compromise our vision just to keep other people happy." The other women nodded sympathetically, offering advice about handling difficult family members and sharing their own stories about wedding conflicts. I sat there listening to myself being discussed as if I weren't present, feeling the sting of being transformed from beloved mother into burdensome obstacle. The final straw came during the traditional bridal shower game where guests were supposed to share advice for the bride. When it was my turn, I stood up and offered sincere words about the importance of communication, compromise, and maintaining family relationships, even when marriage brought new priorities. Jessica smiled and nodded, but I could see the calculation in her eyes as she mentally filed away my comments as evidence of my meddling nature. After the shower, I drove home in a fog of hurt and confusion. How had I become the villain in this story? When had my love and concern for my son transformed into interference and drama? I sat in my driveway for nearly an hour, trying to process the reality that I was no longer welcome in my own son's life in any meaningful way. That evening, Michael called to thank me for attending the shower and to clarify expectations for the wedding itself. His voice was formal and distant as he explained that Jessica had been upset by some of my comments at the shower, particularly my advice about maintaining family relationships. "She feels like you were criticizing her in front of her friends," he said, and I could hear Jessica coaching him in the background. "I need you to promise me that you won't cause any problems at the wedding. This day is too important to Jessica for there to be any family drama." There was that word again, drama. As if my desire to remain connected to my son was somehow theatrical and unreasonable. As if loving him deeply and wanting to celebrate his happiness made me a problem to be managed rather than a mother to be honored. "I promise I won't cause any problems," I said quietly, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "I just want you to be happy, Michael." "I know, Mom," he replied, his voice softening slightly. "And I am happy. Jessica makes me happier than I've ever been. I just need you to trust that we know what's best for our future." After he hung up, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by the photos and memories of 32 years of motherhood, wondering how I had lost my son to someone who saw me as nothing more than an impediment to her perfect life. I had raised him to be kind, thoughtful, and loyal, but Jessica had somehow convinced him that those very qualities were reasons to distance himself from me. The week before the wedding passed in a blur of final preparations and growing anxiety. Jessica sent me detailed instructions about what to wear, what time to arrive at the venue, and how to behave during various parts of the ceremony and reception. The tone of her messages was polite but firm, like a teacher giving instructions to a particularly slow student. She had chosen a dress for me from an expensive boutique, something she described as age-appropriate and photograph-friendly. When I went to pick it up, I discovered it was a beige, shapeless shift that would blend into the background of any photo. Meanwhile, Jessica's mother would be wearing an elegant navy blue dress that coordinated beautifully with the wedding colors. 2 days before the wedding, Jessica called with a final request that felt more like an ultimatum. She had decided that having divorced parents and step-relatives in the receiving line would be too complicated and confusing for guests, so she was simplifying things by having only immediate family participate. Since I was technically immediate family but David wasn't there to escort me, it would be easier if I just went straight to my seat after the ceremony. "You understand, don't you, Patty?" she asked, her voice sugary sweet. "We just want everything to run smoothly, and having too many people in the receiving line makes it feel crowded and disorganized. You'll still be in all the important photos, of course." Of course I understood. I understood that Jessica was systematically erasing me from every traditional role I should have played in my son's wedding. I was being reduced from mother of the groom to barely tolerated guest, and my son was either too blind or too whipped to see what was happening. The night before the wedding, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and remembering David's voice from years ago, warning me about people who used kindness as a weapon. As a guidance counselor, I had encountered students and parents who were masters of manipulation, people who could make their victims feel grateful for mistreatment and guilty for objecting to abuse. Jessica was a master of this art, and she had turned it on my family with devastating effectiveness. She had isolated Michael from my influence while making him believe it was his idea. She had painted me as the problem while positioning herself as the solution. She had taken everything I should have been allowed to enjoy about my son's wedding and redistributed it to serve her own needs. Tomorrow would be the culmination of months of careful manipulation. A day when I would sit in the third row and watch my son marry someone who had successfully convinced him that loving his mother was somehow disloyal to his wife. I would smile and take photos and pretend to be happy while grieving the loss of the relationship that had defined my life for over 3 decades. But as I lay there in the darkness, something began to shift inside me. The hurt and confusion that had dominated my thoughts for months was slowly being replaced by something colder and more focused. I had spent my career helping young people navigate complex social dynamics and identify manipulation when they saw it. I knew exactly what Jessica had done to my family, and I was beginning to understand that gentle protests and hurt feelings were not going to be enough to address it. Jessica had declared war on my relationship with my son, and she had been winning because I hadn't even realized we were fighting. She had used my love for Michael as a weapon against me, knowing that I would back down rather than risk causing him distress. She had counted on my desire to keep the peace to prevent me from calling out her behavior. Tomorrow, I would play my assigned role in Jessica's perfect wedding, sitting quietly in the third row and smiling for photos that would capture the beginning of my son's new life without me. But Jessica had made one crucial mistake in her campaign: to erase me from Michael's life. She had underestimated who she was dealing with, and she was about to learn that some people fight back in ways she never saw coming. The woman who had spent 27 years dealing with manipulative teenagers and entitled parents was about to remind Jessica Chen that experience and patience could be far more dangerous than youth and beauty. She wanted to play games with family loyalty and emotional manipulation? Fine. But she was about to discover that she wasn't the only one who knew how to play those games, and she definitely wasn't the only one who knew how to win them. As dawn broke on Michael's wedding day, I got up and began preparing for what would be either the end of my relationship with my son or the beginning of Jessica's education in exactly why you don't mess with a mother's love. Either way, it was going to be a day that none of us would ever forget. The morning of the wedding arrived with unseasonably cold weather for late spring in Denver. I woke at 5:30. My body refusing to sleep despite the exhaustion that had settled into my bones over the past few months. Outside my bedroom window, gray clouds gathered ominously. and I couldn't help but see it as an omen of what was to come. I moved through my morning routine with mechanical precision, showering and styling my hair the way the hairdresser had recommended when Jessica insisted I get it done professionally. The beige dress hung in my closet like a surrender flag, and as I slipped it on, I caught sight of myself in the full-length mirror David had installed years ago. I looked exactly like what Jessica wanted me to be: forgettable, diminished, someone who would fade into the background of her perfect day. But as I stared at my reflection, something crystallized in my mind. The woman looking back at me wasn't the same person who had raised Michael, who had spent decades advocating for students, who had built a life of purpose and meaning. Jessica had been slowly erasing that woman, replacing her with this pale shadow who apologized for existing and accepted mistreatment as the price of maintaining family peace. I reached into my jewelry box and pulled out the pearl necklace David had given me for our 20th anniversary. Jessica had specifically told me not to wear anything that might distract from the bridal party's coordinated jewelry. But suddenly, I didn't care what Jessica wanted. I fastened the clasp and felt a small spark of my true self returning. The wedding venue was a restored mansion on the outskirts of Denver, the kind of place that charged premium prices for the privilege of saying you got married somewhere with history and character. As I pulled into the parking lot, I could see vendors bustling around with flowers and decorations, transforming the already elegant space into Jessica's vision of perfection. I had arrived early, ostensibly to help with any last-minute preparations, though Jessica had made it clear that my help wasn't needed or wanted. Instead, I sat in my car for a few minutes, watching the controlled chaos of wedding preparation and thinking about the conversation I'd had with my neighbor Eleanor the night before. Eleanor was 82 years old and had been married to her husband for 57 years before he passed. She'd watched my relationship with Michael deteriorate over the past year with the sharp eyes of someone who had seen enough of life to recognize manipulation when she saw it. "Honey," she'd said as we sat on her front porch drinking iced tea, "I've watched that girl work on your boy like a snake charmer. She's got him so turned around he doesn't know which way is up. But here's the thing about snakes. They always overreach eventually." Eleanor had raised 4 children and helped raise 12 grandchildren. She'd buried her husband, survived cancer twice, and outlived most of her contemporaries. When she spoke, people listened, and what she'd told me had planted a seed that was now growing into something dangerous. "You've been playing defense this whole time," she'd said, her weathered hands wrapped around her glass. "That girl's been on offense since day one, and you've been letting her set the rules of the game. But you know what I learned in my 82 years? Sometimes the best defense is a good offense, and sometimes people need to learn that actions have consequences." As I walked toward the venue entrance, Eleanor's words echoed in my mind. I had been playing defense, accepting Jessica's narrative about my role in their lives, allowing her to redefine my relationship with my son. But I was done accepting. I was done apologizing for loving my child. And I was definitely done letting a manipulative 28-year-old dictate the terms of my existence. The bride's preparation room was a flurry of activity when I peeked in to say hello. Jessica sat in the center like a queen holding court, surrounded by her bridesmaids and female relatives. Her hair was being styled by a professional who'd been flown in from Los Angeles, and her makeup artist was applying foundation that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. "Patricia," Jessica called out when she saw me, her voice bright with artificial warmth. "Don't you look lovely in that dress? It's absolutely perfect for someone your age." The comment was designed to remind everyone present that I was older, less relevant, someone to be humored rather than respected. Her bridesmaids tittered politely, and I forced myself to smile and thank her for the compliment. "I just wanted to see if there was anything I could help with," I offered, knowing the answer but needing to play my part for a little while longer. "Oh, you're so sweet, but we have everything under control," Jessica replied, not even looking at me as the makeup artist continued working. Actually, could you check on Michael? I'm worried he might be nervous, and you know how he gets. Maybe you could calm him down or something." The dismissal was clear, and once again I was being relegated to the role of errand runner. But this time, instead of feeling hurt, I felt a cold satisfaction. Jessica was giving me exactly what I needed: access to Michael before she could get her claws into him for the day. I found my son in the groom's preparation room, adjusting his tie for the 10th time while his best friend Jake tried to distract him with jokes that weren't landing. Michael looked handsome in his tuxedo, but I could see the stress lines around his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands that had appeared whenever he was anxious since he was a little boy. "Mom?" he said when he saw me, and for just a moment, his face lit up with genuine warmth before the careful distance he'd been maintaining reasserted itself. "Thanks for coming to check on me." Jessica thought I might be nervous. Of course she did. Jessica knew exactly how to position herself as the caring fiancé, while making me seem like the worried mother who needed to be managed. But I could see what she couldn't. Michael was more than nervous. He was terrified. "Are you having second thoughts?" I asked gently, settling into a chair beside him while Jake tactfully stepped out to give us privacy. "No, of course not," Michael said quickly, but his eyes didn't meet mine. "I love Jessica. I want to marry her. The whole thing is so expensive, and I've been thinking about what you said about the budget." There it was. Despite months of Jessica's manipulation, my practical, responsible son was still in there somewhere, still worried about the financial burden he was taking on. I could have pushed then, could have pointed out all the ways Jessica had manipulated him into this position. But I'd learned something important from watching Jessica work. Sometimes the most effective approach was the subtle one. "Michael," I said carefully, "I want you to be happy. That's all I've ever wanted. If Jessica makes you happy, then I'm happy for you." He looked surprised by my response, clearly expecting another conversation about money or concerns about his future. Instead, I was giving him what Jessica had trained him to expect from a supportive mother: unconditional acceptance of his choices. "I know you've been worried about the costs," I continued, "but you're a smart man with a good career. I'm sure you'll figure out how to make it work." The relief on his face was palpable, and for the first time in months he hugged me with genuine affection. "Thanks, Mom. I needed to hear that. Jessica's been so stressed about making sure everything is perfect, and I guess some of that rubbed off on me." "Out!" I hugged him back, memorizing the feeling of my son's arms around me, because I suspected it might be a long time before I felt it again. What I was about to do would probably destroy our relationship, at least temporarily. But I'd watched Jessica systematically poison him against me for months, and I knew that unless something dramatic changed, I was going to lose him anyway. "I should let you finish getting ready," I said, pulling back from the hug. "I'll see you out there." As I left the groom's room, I pulled out my phone and sent a text message to my friend Susan, who worked as a private investigator for a law firm downtown. 6 months ago, when I first started feeling uneasy about Jessica, I'd asked Susan to do some background research. Not because I wanted to find dirt, but because something about Jessica's stories hadn't added up, and my experience as a guidance counselor had taught me to trust my instincts about people. What Susan had found was interesting, though not necessarily damning. Jessica Chen had grown up in an upper-middle-class family in California, attended private schools, and graduated from USC with a marketing degree. But she'd also accumulated significant credit card debt in college and had a pattern of moving from job to job every 12 to 18 months. Her social media presence was carefully curated to suggest a lifestyle she couldn't actually afford, and there were gaps in her employment history that corresponded with periods when she'd been involved with older, financially stable men. None of it was criminal, but it painted a picture of someone who lived beyond her means and had learned to rely on others to fund her lifestyle. The wedding expenses that were causing Michael so much stress weren't just about Jessica's dream day. They were about maintaining an image she'd built but couldn't sustain on her own income. My text to Susan was simple. "It's time. Are you ready?" Her response came back immediately. "Everything's in place. Just say when." I tucked my phone away and walked toward the main venue where guests were beginning to arrive. The transformation was stunning. Jessica had indeed created something beautiful, if financially ruinous. White roses and orchids covered every surface, and the lighting had been designed to create a romantic, ethereal atmosphere. It was the kind of wedding that would photograph beautifully and generate envious comments on social media for years to come. I took my assigned seat in the third row, behind Jessica's extended family and in front of Michael's college friends. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I was literally being pushed to the back, made secondary to people who had known my son for a fraction of the time I had. As more guests arrived, I began to notice things that might have escaped the attention of someone less familiar with Jessica's character. The guest list was heavily weighted toward her side, with at least 2/3 of the attendees being her friends, family, or professional contacts. Michael's side was smaller and seemed to consist mainly of people who were there out of obligation rather than genuine excitement. I also noticed the photographers. Jessica had hired 3 different teams to capture every moment of the day, and they moved through the crowd like sharks, documenting everything with the intensity of people who were being paid premium rates. Every smile, every tear, every candid moment was being preserved for posterity, creating a record of Jessica's perfect day that would undoubtedly be shared extensively on social media. The ceremony itself was beautiful in the way that expensive things often are. Jessica walked down the aisle in a dress that probably cost more than most people's cars, her face radiant with the satisfaction of someone who had gotten everything she wanted. Michael waited at the altar looking handsome but slightly overwhelmed, like a man who wasn't entirely sure how he'd ended up in this position. The vows were traditional, which surprised me given Jessica's tendency toward elaborate personalization in every other aspect of the wedding. But as I listened to them promise to love and cherish each other, I realized that Jessica had chosen standard vows because they were generic enough to sound meaningful without actually requiring her to be vulnerable or honest about her feelings. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the crowd erupted in applause and camera flashes. Jessica's smile was triumphant as she kissed Michael, and I could see her mentally cataloging every detail to be savored later. She had achieved her goal, a wedding that would establish her social status and provide the kind of romantic mythology she could build a marriage on. The receiving line formed immediately after the ceremony, and I watched from my third-row seat as guests congratulated the happy couple. True to Jessica's instructions, I wasn't part of the official greeting process, so I waited until the line dwindled before approaching my son and his new wife. "Congratulations," I said to Michael, squeezing his hand and kissing his cheek. "I'm so proud of you." "Thanks, Mom," he replied, his smile genuine but tired. The stress of the day was already showing on his face, and I could see the exhaustion that came from trying to live up to someone else's vision of perfection. When I turned to Jessica, she was practically glowing with satisfaction. Her makeup was still flawless despite the tears she'd shed during the ceremony, and her dress remained pristine despite all the hugging and congratulations. She looked like a woman who had just won a contest she'd been training for her entire life. "Jessica, you look absolutely beautiful," I said, meaning it despite everything else. "The ceremony was lovely." "Thank you, Patricia," she replied, her voice warm but her eyes calculating. "I'm so glad you enjoyed it. Michael and I put so much thought into making sure everything was perfect." The comment was subtle but pointed. Michael and I, not we as a family, or we with input from loved ones. Even in her moment of triumph, Jessica couldn't resist reinforcing the boundaries she'd established, reminding me that I was an outsider to their partnership. The cocktail hour was held in the mansion's garden, where guests mingled among more elaborate floral arrangements while waiters circulated with expensive hors d'oeuvres and premium cocktails. I found myself gravitating toward Michael's friends and colleagues, people who seemed as overwhelmed by the event's opulence as I was. "Mrs. Wells," said Jake, Michael's best friend since college, appearing at my elbow with a beer in hand. "Hell of a wedding. Jessica really went all out." "She certainly did," I agreed, accepting a glass of wine from a passing waiter. "How are you doing, Jake? I feel like I haven't seen you in months." "Yeah, well, wedding planning kept Michael pretty busy," Jake said, and I caught something in his tone that suggested he had thoughts about the process. He's been stressed out of his mind about the costs, but Jessica had her heart set on all this. Jake gestured around the garden, taking in the imported flowers, the professional lighting, the small army of vendors required to create Jessica's vision. "I mean, it's beautiful and all, but Jesus. My girlfriend and I are talking about getting engaged, and if she expected something like this, I'd have to take out a second mortgage." I filed away Jake's comment, noting that even Michael's closest friend had observed the financial strain the wedding was causing. If Jake had noticed, then others probably had too, which meant Jessica's perfect day was built on a foundation that was more fragile than it appeared. "Michael mentioned you helped him pick out Jessica's engagement ring," I said carefully. "That must have been fun." Jake's expression shifted slightly, and he glanced around to make sure no one was listening before leaning closer. "Can I tell you something, Mrs. Wells? Because you're his mom, and I think you should know. Michael didn't really pick out that ring. Jessica did." The wine in my glass suddenly tasted bitter as Jake continued. "She dragged him to like 6 different jewelry stores, taking pictures of rings and talking about settings and carats. She knew exactly what she wanted, down to the specific cut and clarity. Michael just paid for it." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The engagement ring hadn't been a romantic gesture from my son to the woman he loved. It had been a purchase ordered by a woman who knew how to get what she wanted. Jessica had orchestrated her own proposal, managing the details to ensure she got exactly the ring she wanted, while allowing Michael to believe he was making the romantic gesture. "She's very particular about what she likes," I said diplomatically, not wanting to put Jake in an uncomfortable position by asking him to criticize his best friend's wife. "Yeah, that's one way to put it," Jake replied with a laugh that held no humor. "Look, I want Michael to be happy, and if Jessica makes him happy, then I'm happy for him. But between you and me, I've never seen him so stressed about money. He's been working overtime for months just to keep up with the wedding expenses." Before I could respond, Jessica appeared at Jake's shoulder with the kind of perfect timing that suggested she'd been monitoring conversations throughout the garden. Her smile was bright and welcoming, but her eyes were sharp as they moved between Jake and me. "Jake, are you taking good care of Patricia?" she asked, slipping her arm through his in a gesture that looked friendly but effectively separated him from me. "I want to make sure all our family feels included and comfortable." The word family hung in the air like a claim of ownership. Jessica was already redefining the boundaries, making it clear that while I might be related to Michael by blood, she was now the one who determined what family meant and how it functioned. "Actually, Patricia, I've been looking for you," Jessica continued, her grip on Jake's arm guiding him away from me. "There are some people I'd love for you to meet. Michael's aunts from his father's side are here, and I thought you might like to catch up with them." It was a masterful redirection. Jessica was removing Jake from my influence while appearing to be thoughtful about my social needs. She was also subtly reminding me that David's family had traveled to attend the wedding, implying that I should be grateful for their presence rather than focused on whatever conversation I'd been having with Jake. As Jessica led Jake away, I caught his eye over her shoulder. He gave me a look that was part apology and part warning, and I realized that I wasn't the only one who had recognized Jessica's manipulative nature. But like Michael, Jake was trapped by social conventions and the desire to avoid conflict, forced to play along with Jessica's performance to maintain his friendship with my son. I spent the next hour circulating through the garden, making small talk with relatives I hadn't seen in years, and listening to guest after guest praise the beauty and elegance of the wedding. Everyone seemed genuinely impressed by what Jessica had created, and several people mentioned how lucky Michael was to have found someone with such sophisticated taste and attention to detail. But I also began to notice other things. Conversations that stopped when I approached. Glances exchanged between Jessica's friends when they thought no one was looking. A tension beneath the celebration that suggested not everyone was as enchanted by the bride as they pretended to be. During dinner, I was seated at a table with David's siblings and their spouses, people I'd known for decades but rarely saw outside of major family events. The conversation was pleasant but superficial, focused on safe topics like travel and grandchildren rather than anything that might approach the complicated dynamics of the day. But as the evening progressed and the wine flowed, tongues began to loosen slightly. David's brother Tom, who had never been known for his diplomatic skills, made a comment that caused his wife to kick him under the table. "Hell of an expensive party," he said, gesturing around the elegantly decorated ballroom where dinner was being served. "Hope Michael's got a good financial planner because this must have cost more than my first house." His wife, Margaret, shot him a warning look, but the comment hung in the air, and I could see other family members exchanging glances. Everyone had noticed the extravagance, and they were all thinking the same thing. How was Michael paying for all this? As if summoned by the conversation, Jessica appeared at our table, making her rounds as the gracious hostess. She looked stunning, in her reception dress, a different but equally expensive creation that she'd changed into after the ceremony. And her energy was infectious as she thanked everyone for coming. "I hope you're all enjoying the dinner," she said, her hand resting possessively on the back of my chair. "Michael and I worked so hard to choose the perfect menu. We wanted everything to be absolutely flawless for our guests." Again, that proprietary language. Michael and I, our guests, our vision. Jessica was establishing ownership not just of the wedding, but of the entire family narrative, positioning herself as the decision-maker while reducing Michael to a supporting role in his own life. "Everything is beautiful, dear," Margaret said diplomatically. "You've certainly created a memorable evening." "Thank you so much," Jessica beamed. "You know, Patricia has been such a help throughout the planning process. She's been so understanding about letting Michael and me make our own choices without interference. I know some mothers-in-law can be. Well, let's just say I feel very lucky." The comment was poison wrapped in praise, designed to make me look good while actually establishing a narrative about mothers-in-law who interfere and the brides who have to manage them. Jessica was training the family to see me as someone who needed to be managed rather than consulted, setting the stage for future interactions where my opinions would be dismissed as meddling. I smiled and nodded, playing my assigned role, but inside I was taking careful note of Jessica's tactics. She was good at this game, better than most people I'd encountered in my professional career. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed that I was playing the same game she was, that I cared more about maintaining appearances than about protecting my relationship with my son. She was about to learn how wrong she was. After dinner, the dancing began with Jessica and Michael's first dance to a song that had been choreographed and rehearsed for weeks. They moved across the floor with the precision of people who had practiced every step, and the photographer captured every moment from multiple angles. It was beautiful in the way that performance art is beautiful. Technically perfect, but somehow lacking in spontaneous emotion. I watched from my table as other couples joined them on the dance floor, and I couldn't help but remember my own wedding day, when David and I had stumbled through our first dance, laughing at our mistakes and holding each other close despite our lack of skill. There had been no choreographer, no professional photographer, no audience of 200 guests watching our every move. Just two people in love, trying not to step on each other's feet while promising to spend their lives together. As the evening continued, I noticed that Michael seemed increasingly tired despite the celebration surrounding him. The stress of the day was showing on his face, and several times I caught him checking his phone, presumably monitoring the costs that were still accumulating even as the party continued. Jessica, meanwhile, was in her element, working the room like a politician at a campaign event. She danced with the groomsmen, posed for photos with various combinations of family and friends, and made sure that every moment was being documented for the social media posts that would undoubtedly follow. It was nearly 11 o'clock when Jessica finally approached my table again, this time with a different energy than her earlier visits. The reception was winding down, and many of the older guests had already left, but the remaining crowd was showing no signs of slowing down. The bar was still busy, the dance floor was packed, and the party showed every sign of continuing well into the morning hours. "Patricia," Jessica said, her voice carrying a tone of false concern, "you must be exhausted. It's been such a long day, and I know these late nights can be hard at your age. Please don't feel like you need to stay until the very end." There it was again. Your age. Jessica couldn't resist the subtle digs that reminded everyone present that I was older, less energetic, someone who belonged at home in bed rather than celebrating with the younger crowd. She was giving me permission to leave while making it clear that my departure would be welcomed rather than missed. "I'm getting a bit tired," I admitted, which was true. The emotional strain of the day had been exhausting, and I could feel the weight of months of manipulation and exclusion settling into my bones. "Of course you are," Jessica said sympathetically. "You've been such a trooper today, and I want you to know how much Michael and I appreciate everything you've done to make this day special." The lie was delivered with such conviction that someone who didn't know better might have believed it, but I knew exactly what I had contributed to making the day special. Nothing. I had been systematically excluded from every decision, relegated to the role of audience member rather than participant, and dismissed whenever I tried to offer input or support. As I gathered my purse and prepared to leave, I took one last look around the ballroom where my son was celebrating the beginning of his new life. He was dancing with one of Jessica's bridesmaids, smiling and laughing in a way that reminded me of the boy he used to be before the stress of wedding planning and financial pressure had aged him. For just a moment, he looked happy in an uncomplicated way, and I felt a pang of regret for what I was about to do. But then I saw Jessica watching him from across the room, her expression calculating even in the midst of celebration, and I remembered all the ways she had manipulated and diminished both of us to get to this moment. My son deserved to know who he had married, and I deserved to have my voice heard, even if it meant burning down the perfect image Jessica had worked so hard to create. I said my goodbyes to the remaining family members and made my way toward the exit, stopping to hug Michael one last time. He was sweaty from dancing and loose from champagne, more relaxed than I'd seen him in months. "Thanks for everything, Mom," he said, holding me tight. "I know this whole process has been stressful, but having you here today meant everything to me." The sincerity in his voice almost broke my resolve. This was my son, the baby I'd carried for 9 months, the toddler who'd clung to my legs when he was scared, the teenager who'd called me from college when he was homesick. Whatever else happened, I loved him more than my own life, and I wanted him to be happy, but I also wanted him to be free, and as long as Jessica controlled his perception of reality, he would never be truly free to make his own choices. What I was about to do would hurt him, probably more than anything I'd ever done in his life. But sometimes loving someone meant being willing to be hated by them, especially when they were too close to a situation to see it clearly. "I love you, Michael," I said, memorizing the feeling of his arms around me. "No matter what happens, remember that everything I do comes from love." He pulled back and looked at me with mild concern, probably wondering why I sounded so serious at what should have been a purely celebratory moment. "Are you okay, Mom? You sound like you're saying goodbye forever or something." "Just tired," I said, forcing a smile. "Go enjoy your party. This is your night." As I walked toward the parking lot, I pulled out my phone and sent another text to Susan. Phase 1 complete. Are you ready for phase 2? Her response came back immediately. Standing by, just give me the word. I sat in my car for a few minutes, watching the warm light spilling from the mansion's windows and listening to the faint sound of music and laughter drifting across the parking lot. Inside, Jessica was celebrating her triumph, surrounded by friends and family who saw her as the beautiful bride who had created the perfect wedding. Michael was dancing and drinking and probably feeling like the luckiest man alive. Neither of them had any idea that their perfect night was about to become the beginning of a very different story. One where the woman they'd written off as a harmless, aging mother-in-law would remind them that experience and patience could be far more dangerous than youth and beauty. Jessica wanted to play games with family loyalty and financial manipulation? Fine. But she was about to learn that she wasn't the only one who knew how to play those games, and she definitely wasn't the only one who could win them. I started my car and drove home through the quiet Denver streets, already planning the moves that would teach Jessica Chen exactly why you don't mess with a mother's love. She'd had her perfect wedding day. Now it was time for her to learn about the consequences of the choices she'd made to get it. The real game was just beginning, and Jessica had no idea she was already losing. I slept surprisingly well that night, considering what I was about to unleash. Perhaps it was the relief of finally having a plan, or maybe it was the exhaustion from months of emotional manipulation, but I woke up Monday morning feeling more energized than I had in ages. The wedding was over, Jessica had gotten her perfect day, and now it was time for the real world to reassert itself. My first call was to Susan at 8 o'clock sharp. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional despite the early hour. Patricia, I was wondering when you'd call. How did the wedding go? Exactly as expected, I replied, settling into my kitchen chair with a cup of coffee. Jessica played her part beautifully, and Michael is completely under her spell. But I noticed some interesting things during the reception that confirm what we suspected about her financial situation. Susan had been busy during the months leading up to the wedding, conducting the kind of thorough background investigation that her law firm specialized in. What she'd discovered went far beyond the credit card debt and employment gaps I'd already known about. Jessica's financial situation was much more precarious than anyone realized, and her pattern of relationships with older, financially stable men was more deliberate than coincidental. Tell me what you found, I said, though I'd already heard most of it during our previous conversations. Jessica Chen has approximately $67,000 in credit card debt spread across 8 different cards, Susan began, reading from her notes. She's also behind on her car payments, owes back rent on her apartment, and has been making minimum payments on her student loans for 3 years. Her current salary as a marketing coordinator barely covers her basic living expenses, let alone the lifestyle she maintains on social media. I'd suspected as much from observing Jessica's spending habits and her insistence on expensive wedding vendors. But hearing the actual numbers was still shocking. No wonder she'd been so determined to lock down Michael, who had a steady job, good credit, and savings. But here's the interesting part, Susan continued. 3 weeks before the wedding, Jessica opened a new credit card account with a $15,000 limit. She maxed it out within 48 hours, using the money to cover wedding expenses that Michael thought were being paid for by her parents. The betrayal was even deeper than I'd imagined. Jessica hadn't just manipulated Michael into overspending on their wedding, she'd been secretly accumulating additional debt in her own name while allowing him to believe her family was contributing financially. The perfect wedding had been built on a foundation of lies and hidden debt that would become Michael's responsibility the moment they said, "I do." There's more, Susan said. I've been monitoring her social media activity, and she's already posted 43 photos from the wedding with captions about their dream honeymoon in Bali. The problem is, the honeymoon she's advertising costs approximately $12,000, and Michael's bank account shows he only has about $8,000 in available credit across his cards. My stomach dropped as I realized what this meant. Jessica was planning to put them even deeper in debt for a honeymoon that would serve primarily as social media content, further cementing the image of prosperity she'd worked so hard to create. Michael would return from his honeymoon to discover they were financially underwater before their marriage was even a week old. "Susan, I need you to prepare a comprehensive report of everything you've found," I said. "Financial records, employment history, the pattern of relationships, everything. And I need it delivered to Michael's office by noon today." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Patricia, are you sure about this? Once I send that report, there's no taking it back. It's going to destroy their honeymoon and probably their marriage." I thought about Michael's exhausted face at the wedding, the stress lines that had appeared around his eyes over the past year, the way he'd been working overtime to fund Jessica's vision of perfection. I thought about the woman I'd raised, the values I'd tried to instill in him, and the way Jessica had systematically undermined both his financial security and his relationship with his family. "Send the report," I said firmly, "but make sure it comes from your law firm's letterhead, not from me. I want this to look like a routine background check that was ordered before the wedding, but didn't come through until now." The beauty of Susan's plan was its plausibility. Many people did have background checks run on potential spouses, especially when significant financial assets were involved. The timing would seem unfortunate but not suspicious, and the information would be presented as objective facts rather than accusations from a disapproving mother-in-law. My second call was to my accountant, Robert Martinez, who had been handling my finances since David's death. Robert was discreet, professional, and had connections throughout Denver's financial community that would prove useful for what I had planned. "Robert, I need to discuss something sensitive with you," I said when he answered. "It's about Michael and his new wife." Robert had known Michael since he was a teenager and had always taken a paternal interest in his financial well-being. When I explained Jessica's debt situation and the way she'd been manipulating Michael's spending, his response was immediate and angry. "That little manipulator," he said, his usual professional demeanor cracking. "Michael is a good kid with a solid financial foundation, and she's going to ruin him. What can we do?" "I need you to reach out to your contacts at the credit agencies," I said. "I want to know about any new accounts Jessica has opened recently, any applications she's submitted, and any changes to her credit status. Can you do that without it being traced back to me?" Robert was quiet for a moment, considering the legal and ethical implications of what I was asking. "Technically, as Michael's financial advisor, I have legitimate reasons to be concerned about his spouse's creditworthiness. I can make some inquiries under the guise of helping them establish joint financial planning." "Perfect. And Robert? If you find anything particularly concerning, I think Michael deserves to know about it, don't you?" "Absolutely. A good financial advisor always keeps his clients informed about potential risks to their financial security." By 10 o'clock that morning, I had set several wheels in motion that would soon converge to create a perfect storm around Jessica's carefully constructed facade. But I wasn't done yet. The credit score destruction that I'd promised myself would require more direct action, and I had spent weeks preparing for this moment. The key to destroying someone's credit score isn't just about creating debt. It's about creating a pattern of behavior that demonstrates financial irresponsibility and deception. Jessica had already provided most of the raw material through her hidden credit cards and mounting debt. I just needed to help accelerate the natural consequences of her choices. My next call was to Thomas Chen, Jessica's father, whose number I'd obtained through some careful social media detective work. According to Jessica's wedding narratives, her parents were successful professionals who had contributed significantly to the wedding expenses. But Susan's investigation had revealed a different story. The Chen family was solidly middle class, and Jessica's father was a hard-working accountant who had sacrificed significantly to help pay for his daughter's education and wedding. "Mr. Chen, this is Patricia Wells, Michael's mother. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." Thomas Chen's voice was warm and tired when he answered. "Mrs. Wells, of course. Jessica speaks about you often. How are you doing after the beautiful wedding?" The irony of his comment wasn't lost on me. Jessica spoke about me often, but apparently not truthfully. I suspected that Thomas Chen had a very different impression of our relationship than the reality Jessica had created. "I'm doing well, thank you. I was actually calling because I'm concerned about some financial matters that have come to my attention. I was hoping we could discuss what you and your wife contributed to the wedding expenses, because I think there might be some confusion about the numbers." There was a long pause, and I could hear the sound of papers shuffling in the background. When Thomas spoke again, his voice was careful and concerned. "Mrs. Wells, I'm not sure what Jessica has told Michael's family, but my wife and I contributed $5,000 to the wedding. It was all we could afford, and honestly, it was more than we probably should have spent. We told Jessica she would need to keep the costs reasonable, because that was our limit. $5,000. Jessica had allowed Michael to believe her parents were covering at least half of the $40,000 wedding cost, when in reality they'd contributed roughly 12%. The math was staggering. Michael had paid for nearly $35,000 of wedding expenses while believing he was only responsible for about $20,000. "Mr. Chen, I think there's been a significant misunderstanding about the wedding finances. According to my son's records, the total cost was around $40,000, and he was under the impression that your family was covering a substantial portion of that." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice was tight with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. $40,000? "Mrs. Wells, that's impossible. Jessica promised us she would keep the wedding under $15,000 total. She said Michael had agreed to that budget and that our $5,000 would cover roughly a third of the costs. And there it was. Jessica had lied to everyone. She'd told her parents the wedding cost $15,000 while spending $40,000. She'd told Michael her parents were contributing $20,000 while they'd actually given $5,000. She'd created a web of deception that allowed her to fund her dream wedding while keeping everyone ignorant of the true financial reality. Mr. Chen, I think our children have been victims of some serious financial deception. Would you be willing to meet with me this afternoon to compare notes? I think we both deserve to know exactly what happened." Thomas Chen agreed immediately, and we arranged to meet at a coffee shop downtown at 2 o'clock. His eagerness to understand what had happened suggested that he'd been harboring his own concerns about Jessica's financial honesty, concerns that were now crystallizing into serious worry about what she might have done to both families. After hanging up with Thomas, I made one more call, this one to the credit card company where Jessica had opened her newest account. This was the riskiest part of my plan, but also potentially the most effective. "Customer service, this is Brandon. How can I help you today?" "Hello, I'm calling about a fraudulent account that was opened in my daughter's name," I said, adopting a concerned maternal tone. "Her name is Jessica Chen, and someone has been using her identity to make unauthorized purchases." The representative was immediately sympathetic and transferred me to their fraud department, where I repeated my story with additional details about suspicious charges and unauthorized account activity. I provided Jessica's Social Security number, which Susan had obtained through her investigation, and expressed concern that someone was destroying my daughter's credit. "I need you to put an immediate fraud alert on her account," I continued. "My daughter just got married and is on her honeymoon, so she has no idea this is happening. When she gets back, she's going to be devastated to discover that her credit has been ruined by identity theft." The fraud alert would trigger an automatic review of Jessica's recent credit activity, including all the new accounts she'd opened and the maximum purchases she'd made. More importantly, it would flag her account for additional scrutiny and potentially freeze her ability to open new credit lines while the investigation was ongoing. I repeated this process with 3 other credit card companies where Jessica had recent accounts, each time posing as a concerned family member reporting identity theft. By noon, Jessica's credit profile would be flagged across multiple systems, creating a bureaucratic nightmare that would take weeks to resolve, and potentially devastating her credit score in the process. My meeting with Thomas Chen was illuminating in ways I hadn't expected. He arrived at the coffee shop looking like a man who had aged years overnight, carrying a folder full of bank statements and receipts that told the story of a father who had sacrificed significantly for his daughter's happiness. "Mrs. Wells, I owe you an apology," he said before he'd even sat down. "After our phone call this morning, I went through all of our financial records, and I'm afraid Jessica has been lying to us about more than just the wedding costs." Thomas spread the documents across our small table, showing me a pattern of financial requests that stretched back several years. Jessica had borrowed money for a security deposit on an apartment that turned out to cost twice what she'd claimed. She'd asked for help with emergency medical bills that appeared to be cosmetic procedures. She'd received thousands of dollars for career development courses that seemed to be shopping sprees based on the credit card statements he'd uncovered. "She's taken nearly $20,000 from us over the past 3 years, Thomas said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "My wife and I thought we were helping our daughter build a stable life, but apparently we were just enabling her to live beyond her means." The picture that emerged from Thomas's records, combined with what Susan had discovered, was of a young woman who had been systematically deceiving everyone in her life to fund a lifestyle she couldn't afford. Her relationship with Michael wasn't a love story. It was a financial strategy designed to transfer her debt burden to someone with better credit and more assets. "Mr. Chen, I think we need to make sure our children understand what they've gotten themselves into," I said carefully. "Jessica's debt situation is much worse than either of them realizes, and Michael is about to become legally responsible for obligations he doesn't even know exist." Thomas nodded grimly. "I've been thinking the same thing. My daughter needs to face the consequences of her choices, and your son deserves to know what he's married into. Do you think there's a way to make them understand without completely destroying their marriage?" I considered his question seriously. Thomas Chen was a good man who loved his daughter despite her flaws, and he was struggling with the same painful realization I'd faced. Sometimes loving someone means allowing them to experience the consequences of their actions, even when those consequences are devastating. "I think the truth has a way of coming out whether we facilitate it or not," I said gently. "The question is whether they learn about Jessica's deception from family who care about them, or from creditors and collection agencies who don't." We agreed to coordinate our efforts, sharing information while allowing the natural consequences of Jessica's financial choices to unfold. Thomas would confront Jessica directly about the money she'd taken from her parents, while I would ensure that Michael had access to the complete picture of their financial situation. By the time I returned home from my meeting with Thomas, Susan had already delivered her report to Michael's office. She texted me to confirm that the package had been signed for by Michael personally at 12:47 p.m., which meant he was probably reading it right now while Jessica was posting honeymoon photos from their hotel in Bali. The report was comprehensive and damning, presenting Jessica's financial history in stark, clinical terms that no amount of charm or manipulation could explain away. Bank statements showing chronic overdrafts, credit reports revealing the full extent of her debt, employment records documenting her pattern of leaving jobs when performance reviews indicated problems, and most damaging of all, a timeline that clearly showed how her financial desperation had accelerated in the months leading up to her engagement to Michael. My phone rang at 3:30, and Michael's name appeared on the caller ID. I let it ring 4 times before answering, wanting to sound calm and unsurprised by his call. "Hi, sweetheart. How's the honeymoon?" Michael's voice was tight with stress and confusion when he responded. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you have a background check run on Jessica?" I had prepared for this question, and my answer was technically truthful. "Michael, I would never invade your privacy or Jessica's privacy by ordering a background check. Why would you ask something like that? Because I received a report today from a private investigation firm, and it contains financial information about Jessica that I never knew. The report says it was ordered several weeks ago as part of a routine premarital financial screening, but nobody told me about it. The confusion in his voice was painful to hear, but it was necessary. Michael needed to focus on the information in the report rather than its source, and my denial would keep him from dismissing the findings as a vindictive attack from his disapproving mother. "What kind of information?" I asked, maintaining a tone of concerned curiosity rather than accusation. "Mom, Jessica has over $60,000 in credit card debt. She's behind on payments, her credit score is terrible, and according to this report, she's been lying about her employment history and her family's financial contribution to our wedding. How could I not know any of this?" The pain in Michael's voice was heartbreaking, but I forced myself to remain supportive rather than accusatory. This was his moment of realization, and he needed to reach his own conclusions about what Jessica's deception meant for their marriage. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. What are you going to do?" "I don't know," he said, and I could hear the exhaustion that came from having his entire understanding of reality shifted in a single afternoon. "I tried calling Jessica, but she's not answering her phone. She posted photos this morning of the resort spa and some expensive shopping she did, and now I'm wondering how she's paying for any of this." I wanted to point out that she was probably using credit cards that would become his responsibility, but I held back. Michael was intelligent enough to figure that out on his own, and the realization would be more powerful if it came from his own analysis rather than my suggestions. "Have you talked to her parents?" I asked instead. "That's the other thing," Michael said, his voice growing more strained. "I called her father this morning to thank him again for their contribution to the wedding, and he seemed confused about the amounts we'd discussed. When I mentioned that we appreciated their $20,000 contribution, he told me they only gave $5,000. There it was. Michael was discovering the full scope of Jessica's financial deception, and each new piece of information was forcing him to reevaluate everything he thought he knew about his new wife. The beautiful, sophisticated woman he'd married was revealing herself to be someone who had systematically lied to him about the most fundamental aspects of their shared life. "Michael, I think you need to come home," I said gently. "Whatever is happening with Jessica's finances, you can't address it while you're on the other side of the world, and you certainly can't make any major decisions while you're both stressed and confused about the facts." "I can't just abandon our honeymoon," he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Jessica has been planning this trip for months. She'll be devastated if we cut it short." "Sweetheart, if Jessica has been lying to you about her finances, then she's probably been lying about how this honeymoon is being paid for too. How much more debt are you willing to accumulate before you get some answers?" The silence that followed was long and heavy, filled with the sound of Michael's world, shifting on its axis. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Mom, I think I've made a terrible mistake." Those words should have given me satisfaction, but instead they broke my heart. Michael was my son, and watching him realize that he'd been manipulated and deceived by someone he loved was painful beyond description. But it was also necessary, because the alternative was watching him spend years or even decades trapped in a marriage built on lies and financial exploitation. "Oh, honey," I said softly, "mistakes can be fixed. The question is what you want to do now that you have better information." Michael was quiet for a long moment before responding. "I need to talk to Jessica. I need to understand how we got to this point and whether there's a way to work through it. But first, I need to figure out how much debt we're actually carrying and what our real financial situation looks like." "Do you want me to help you with that?" I offered. "I could contact Robert Martinez and ask him to do a comprehensive review of both of your financial positions. He could give you an objective assessment of where you stand." "Would you do that?" Michael asked, relief evident in his voice. "I feel like I can't trust my own judgment right now, and I need someone who knows what they're doing to help me understand the numbers." "Of course, sweetheart. I'll call Robert this afternoon and ask him to prepare a complete financial analysis. But Michael, you need to be prepared for the possibility that the situation is worse than what you've discovered so far." Robert's analysis, which he completed within 24 hours, painted an even grimmer picture than anyone had anticipated. When combined with Jessica's hidden debts, the wedding expenses, and the ongoing honeymoon costs, Michael's financial position had deteriorated from solid middle-class stability to serious debt that would take years to resolve. More concerning was Robert's projection of their future financial trajectory if Jessica's spending patterns continued. Based on her credit history and recent behavior, Robert estimated that she would accumulate an additional $30,000 to $40,000 in debt within the first year of marriage, potentially pushing them toward bankruptcy. "The bottom line," Robert told me during our phone conversation, "is that Michael has gone from being a financially secure young man to someone who is drowning in debt, and most of that debt was accumulated without his knowledge or consent. This isn't a marriage, it's a financial hostage situation." Michael returned from Bali 3 days later, alone. Jessica had chosen to extend her stay at the resort, claiming she needed time to process the accusations against her and figure out how to repair their relationship. What she was actually doing, according to the credit monitoring reports I was receiving, was continuing to accumulate charges on cards that Michael didn't know existed. When Michael came to my house the evening after his return, he looked like a man who had aged a decade in a single week. His tan from the tropical sun couldn't disguise the exhaustion and stress that had settled into his features, and his usual confident demeanor had been replaced by the hesitant uncertainty of someone who no longer trusted his own judgment. "Mom, I owe you an apology," he said as soon as I opened the door. "You tried to warn me about Jessica, and I accused you of being jealous and interfering. I should have listened to you." I hugged him tightly, feeling the tension in his shoulders, and the way he clung to me like the frightened child he'd once been. "Sweetheart, you don't owe me any apologies. You fell in love with someone who wasn't who she pretended to be. That's not your fault." But even as I comforted him, I knew that the hardest part was still to come. Michael was beginning to understand the scope of Jessica's financial deception, but he hadn't yet grasped the deeper implications of what her behavior revealed about her character. The woman he'd married wasn't just financially irresponsible, she was a calculating manipulator who had targeted him specifically because of his stability and assets. Over the following weeks, the full extent of Jessica's deception continued to unfold like a slow-motion disaster. The fraud alerts I'd placed on her credit accounts had triggered reviews that uncovered additional hidden debts and suspicious activity. Credit card companies began calling Michael's home number looking for Jessica, revealing accounts he'd never known existed. And most damaging of all, Jessica's behavior during the extended honeymoon demonstrated that she had no intention of changing her spending patterns or accepting responsibility for her actions. When Jessica finally returned from Bali 2 weeks later, she arrived with suitcases full of designer purchases and a story about how the misunderstanding about her finances was really Michael's fault for not communicating clearly about their budget expectations. She was prepared to continue the manipulation that had worked so well during their courtship, using tears and accusations to deflect attention from her own behavior. But Michael was no longer the same man she'd left behind. The week of discovery had opened his eyes not just to Jessica's financial deception, but to the pattern of manipulation that had characterized their entire relationship. He could see now how she'd isolated him from my influence, convinced him to take on debt for her vision of perfection, and positioned herself as the victim whenever anyone questioned her choices. The confrontation, when it finally came, was swift and decisive. Michael presented Jessica with the comprehensive financial report that documented her debt, her lies, and the true cost of their wedding and honeymoon. He demanded explanations, accountability, and immediate steps to address the financial crisis she'd created. Jessica's response was entirely predictable: tears, accusations, and attempts to blame everyone else for the situation she'd created. She accused Michael of being controlling and unromantic for caring about money. She blamed me for interfering in their marriage and turning him against her. She claimed that the debt wasn't really that serious and that Michael was overreacting to normal financial challenges that all couples faced. But her manipulation tactics no longer worked on Michael, who had spent 2 weeks analyzing every conversation they'd ever had about money and recognizing the patterns of deception that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. When Jessica realized that tears and accusations weren't going to resolve the situation, she switched to threats, claiming that she would destroy his reputation and career if he didn't support her financially. That threat was the final straw for Michael, who finally understood that Jessica's love had always been conditional on his willingness to fund her lifestyle. The beautiful, sophisticated woman he'd fallen in love with had never existed. She'd been a carefully constructed persona designed to extract maximum financial benefit from their relationship. The divorce proceedings began within 6 weeks of their return from the honeymoon, making their marriage one of the shortest in family history. Jessica fought the dissolution viciously, demanding alimony and claiming that Michael had misrepresented his financial position during their courtship. But her own financial history worked against her, with credit reports and bank statements demonstrating a clear pattern of deception and manipulation. The final blow to Jessica's position came when Thomas Chen agreed to testify about the money his daughter had taken from her parents under false pretenses. His willingness to expose Jessica's lies publicly, despite the embarrassment it caused his family, demonstrated the depth of his disappointment in his daughter's choices and his determination to prevent her from destroying Michael's life the way she'd damaged her own family's finances. The credit score destruction I'd orchestrated through the fraud alerts had done its work thoroughly. Jessica's credit rating had plummeted from marginal to abysmal, making it impossible for her to open new accounts or shift her debt burden to other unsuspecting victims. The bureaucratic nightmare of resolving the fraud alerts had consumed weeks of her time and required her to provide documentation that revealed the full scope of her financial deception to multiple credit agencies. More importantly, the fraud alerts had created a permanent record of suspicious financial activity that would follow Jessica for years, making it difficult for her to secure loans, apartments, or even employment that required a credit check. The perfect credit score she'd once maintained through careful manipulation of minimum payments and balance transfers was now a disaster that would take years to repair, if it could be repaired at all. Michael emerged from the divorce proceedings emotionally scarred but financially intact. Robert Martinez's quick action had prevented Jessica from accessing most of Michael's assets, and the short duration of their marriage limited her ability to claim community property rights. The debt she'd accumulated during their brief marriage remained her responsibility, and Michael was able to escape with his savings and his future earning potential largely preserved. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was the restoration of my relationship with my son. The months of manipulation and isolation that Jessica had imposed were gradually undone as Michael rediscovered the value of family support and honest communication. He began calling regularly again, seeking advice and comfort as he rebuilt his life and learned to trust his own judgment. The lessons of his marriage to Jessica had been expensive, both financially and emotionally, but they'd also been invaluable. Michael emerged from the experience with a much clearer understanding of manipulation tactics, red flags in relationships, and the importance of maintaining independence even within a committed partnership. He'd learned to value substance over surface appeal and to trust the instincts of people who had proven their loyalty over years rather than months. As for Jessica, the last I heard she'd moved back to California, where she was attempting to rebuild her life and her credit rating with limited success. The wedding photos that had once dominated her social media presence were quietly deleted, replaced by inspirational quotes about new beginnings and personal growth. But the financial consequences of her choices would follow her for years. A permanent reminder that actions have consequences and that other people's trust is not a renewable resource. My relationship with Michael grew stronger than it had been before Jessica's manipulative influence nearly destroyed it. We talked regularly about his dating life, his career goals, and his gradual recovery from the trauma of discovering that his marriage had been built on lies. He was more cautious now about romantic relationships, but also more confident in his ability to recognize manipulation and protect himself from predatory behavior. The experience had taught both of us valuable lessons about the importance of maintaining family connections even when outside influences try to undermine them. Michael understood now why I'd been concerned about Jessica from the beginning, and he'd learned to value my perspective as someone who cared about his long-term well-being rather than short-term gratification. Sometimes love means being willing to be hated temporarily to protect someone from long-term harm. My campaign against Jessica's manipulation had been painful and complicated, but it had ultimately saved my son from years of financial exploitation and emotional abuse. Jessica had thought she could isolate Michael from my influence and use his love against him, but she'd underestimated the strength of genuine family bonds and the determination of a mother protecting her child. In the end, Jessica Chen learned an expensive lesson about the difference between temporary charm and lasting character, between surface appeal and genuine worth. She'd ruined her own credit score through years of deception and manipulation, and my role had simply been to accelerate the natural consequences of choices she'd made long before she met my son. The perfect wedding she'd orchestrated had been the beginning of the end of her carefully constructed facade, and the credit score destruction that followed was simply the price of building a life on lies and exploitation. Some people might call my methods harsh or vindictive, but I call them justice. And sometimes justice is exactly what manipulative people need to understand that other people's lives are not resources to be exploited for personal gain. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.